They said she wouldn't last the winter. Said the cold would find her bones, the hunger would break her, and the silence out here would finish whatever was left. But winter came, and she was still standing. Now the snow was gone, replaced by heat that pressed like a heavy hand against the town's back. The sun hung low, bleeding gold and copper through the dust, and every soul in Deadman's Hollow seemed to find a reason to stand in the street. They weren't here for a sermon. They weren't here for a hanging. They were here for her. She stood on the porch of what used to be the saloon, blackened timbers, shattered windows, the smell of char still trapped in the wood. She didn't move. Didn't speak. The brim of her hat shadowed her eyes, but they could feel her watching. The crowd was a mix of whispers and stares, ranch hands, card cheats, widows, even the preacher's boy. Faces she knew. Faces she didn't. Faces that remembered the night the flames rose up and tried to swallow her whole. And then, he came. Out from between the undertaker's parlor and the boarded-up general store, the lonely rancher stepped into the dying light. His boots stirred the dust in slow, deliberate puffs. Hat low. Coat worn at the edges. His shadow stretched long across the street like a crack in the earth. He didn't rush. Men like him didn't need to. The weight of his presence moved ahead of him, rolling through the crowd, settling over the onlookers like a cold fog. The steel at his hip gleamed once, just enough to catch the eye before it disappeared under the edge of his coat again. Closer, closer. She kept her hands at her sides, still as stone. Not an inch of her betrayed what she was thinking, or whether she'd draw first. And then he stopped. The whole town seemed to lean forward without meaning to. Boots scuffed. A horse somewhere snorted and stamped. Even the wind held back. When he finally spoke, his voice carried like the last nail driven into a coffin lid. He said her name. Not the name they knew her by here. Not the one she'd carried into this town like a fresh start. It was the old name, the one buried deep under ashes and years. The name that carried blood on it. The name she thought had died with the people who used it. It cut through the street like a blade. And just like that, the winter she'd survived, felt like it had been nothing more than the quiet before the real storm. The first sound wasn't his boots. It was the air itself, changing, thickening, like the town was holding its breath before a storm. She felt it before she saw him. Then, from the edge of shadow between the undertaker's and the boarded-up store, he stepped out. The lonely rancher. Hat low. Coat edges dusted pale. His shadow stretched long across the dirt, black and thin as a rifle barrel. He didn't hurry. Men like him never did. Every step seemed to push the crowd back an inch, though not a soul turned away. Somewhere on the far porch, a wind chime gave a nervous clink, sharp and lonely in the heat. Her gaze locked on him, but her mind was running fast, running the numbers, weighing the risk. If she drew first, there'd be no mistake, but maybe no way back, either. The scent of kerosene drifted faint from behind her, mingling with the dry taste of dust on her tongue. Somewhere down the street, a loose shutter banged once, then fell still again. He closed the space between them with the slow certainty of a man measuring out the last few feet to something inevitable. His boots left faint imprints in the dirt, each one catching the fading sun like a warning. 10 paces away, he stopped. Shoulders loose, eyes steady, like he'd already made his peace with the outcome. The crowd had gone still enough that she could hear her own breathing, shallow and slow. She could feel their eyes, every one of them waiting to see if her hand would twitch toward the gun. Then, finally, his voice carried over the space between them. Low. Controlled. I'm not here to kill you, he said. The words slid through the hot air like water over stone. No threat in them, but no comfort either. Her hand stayed on the revolver. I've got an offer, he went on, and though his tone was quiet, it seemed to pull the whole street closer. The man nearest the porch leaned in, straining to hear. She didn't speak. She let him keep talking. The man who took everything from you. His pause was deliberate, stretching the space between each word until the air felt like it might snap. He's still alive. A murmur rolled through the crowd, low and sharp, like the first rumble of thunder under a black sky. Her heartbeat slowed instead of quickened, slowed into that dangerous, heavy rhythm she'd known before a fight. Alive. She let the word sink, testing its weight. If it was true, it meant every mile she'd ridden, every grave she'd stood over, every night she'd spent wondering if she'd already missed her chance, none of it was finished. But the way he said it, there was something in his voice. Not pity. Not warning. Something else. She searched his face for it and found only stillness, the kind of stillness you see before a rattler strikes. The street felt smaller now, hemmed in by the weight of eyes and the heat pressing from all sides. The chime on the porch gave one last lonely note. Somewhere far off, a dog barked once, then fell silent. And in that quiet, she understood, whether she took his offer or not, this meeting had already changed everything. He kept talking, his voice low, steady, but she wasn't really listening. Not at first. Something in the way he carried himself, the way his eyes stayed on her like a man looking for a crack in stone, told her he knew things. Things he shouldn't. Her breath felt tight in her chest. If he truly knew her story. If he knew what the badge meant, or what was buried out by the creek. Then he also knew how many graves it had taken to keep her standing here now. And that thought. That thought made her grip her reins just a little tighter. She saw herself years younger, the world still wide open ahead. Riding into a dusty town with her brother beside her, the sun warm and clean on their backs. His laugh had been easy then, untested. The townsfolk had watched them pass like people watching clouds, interested, but harmless. That was before the first bullet ever found them. The next memory was all heat and chaos, dust kicking up around their horses' legs, the sharp scream of gunfire. The ambush had been sudden, cruel. She remembered the burn in her side, the weight of her body pitching from the saddle, the ground rushing up. And through the ringing in her ears, her brother's voice, shouting her name until it broke. And then came the grave. Her father's grave. Under a sky the color of iron, the grass dead and flat around it. She had gone there to speak to him, to lay down the weight she'd been carrying, but instead, she'd found that sheriff's badge nailed into the wood cross at its head. Rusted. Bent. Catching the gray light like an accusation. Was it a warning? A claim? Or was it the killer's way of saying, I was here first? She blinked back to the present, his voice still spilling into the dry air between them. Every word he spoke now felt like it had barbs on it, catching somewhere deep. Would you ride with a man whose hands were already stained? He said he wanted to help. But she'd learned a long time ago, help in the West always came with a price. And sometimes, the price was your life. They said the wind that morning carried a warning, but she didn't listen. It moved through the empty street like a thief, rattling old shutters, brushing against the backs of necks until men shifted in their boots. A single horse stood waiting at the edge of town, the animal's breath curling in the chill like smoke from a dying fire. She stayed still, one hand resting against the worn grip of her revolver, the other shading her eyes. He was there, leaning in the saddle, hat pulled low, as if the day didn't touch him. No one else dared come closer, the silence stretched so thin it felt ready to tear. Somewhere, a wind chime swayed, and the hollow notes carried further than they should have. She told herself she'd only step forward when she knew his intent. But her boots were already moving. The distance between them closed slow, like two storms creeping toward the same patch of sky. Her breath was steady, but inside, the weight of the choice pressed hard. Shoot first, or hear him out? The streets had seen enough blood to answer that question for her, but this wasn't about the town. This was about the name that kept her awake, the name she carried like a splinter under her skin. The dust curled around her ankles, clinging to her coat. A faint tang of kerosene drifted from somewhere down the road, mixing with the dry scent of sun-baked wood. She saw his eyes then, dark, measuring, and still, he hadn't moved his hand from the reins. That was the thing about men like him, they didn't rush. They waited for you to lean too far forward. When he spoke, it wasn't the threat she expected, it was an offer. Not in the words, not yet, but in the weight of his tone. He said he'd come for a reason. That there was a road they needed to ride together, and that the man she thought gone wasn't gone at all. She felt the ground sway beneath her boots. The breath she'd been holding turned sharp in her lungs. Behind him, the horizon was open and endless, the kind of wide that swallowed people whole. She didn't trust him. She didn't trust herself. But she stepped toward the saddle anyway. The crowd that had gathered didn't speak, didn't move. They just watched her swing up beside him, two silhouettes against a dying sun, riding into land where ghosts still had teeth. The town slipped away, each hoofbeat pulling her further from the safety of walls and closer to the jagged edge of her past. Wind tugged at her coat, carrying the faintest sound of the street behind, boots shifting, whispers rising, bets being made. Ahead, the land stretched out bare and brutal. They passed the black ribs of a burned homestead, its ashes long scattered but its shape still carved into the earth. She kept her eyes forward, but the smell of char still found her. He said nothing. Neither did she. Some roads didn't need conversation, only the sound of two riders, and the promise that somewhere ahead, a reckoning waited. They came into the basin with the wind behind them, the kind that rolls low and mean across the ground, carrying the smell of dry grass and something sharper, the kind of scent a man remembers from the morning before a killing. The air felt tight, like the sky was leaning closer to hear what might happen. She kept her horse at his shoulder, eyes fixed ahead where the land rose in a dark ripple. Up there, scattered along the ridge, they waited. Figures cut from dust and shadow, rifles laid casual across their laps, the easy posture of men who believed no one could touch them here. Her pulse ticked steady in her ears, louder than the creak of the saddle. He didn't speak, didn't even glance at her. Just rode on, loose in the saddle, as if the guns ahead were no more than fence posts. That was what unsettled her, not arrogance, not ignorance, but the quiet certainty in his movements. It was the way a man carried himself when he'd already made peace with what he was about to do. The ridge came closer. She could see faces now, the crooked grins, the narrowing eyes. Someone spat into the dirt. Someone else tapped the stock of his rifle like a drumbeat. The sound echoed in her head, matching her heartbeat. She tried to read the rancher's hands, searching for the twitch that would give him away, but they stayed still, resting on the horn of the saddle. One of the men on the ridge called down, his voice sharp enough to split the still air. She didn't catch the words, only the laughter that followed. It wasn't the kind of laughter meant to be shared, it was the kind that said you weren't leaving. She thought of turning back then. Just a touch of the reins and she could be gone. But her boot stayed in the stirrups. Her hand brushed the butt of her revolver, feeling the rough grooves worn by years of use. The rancher finally looked at her, not a question, not a warning. Just a glance that felt like it carried the weight of a choice. The kind of glance a man gives right before the first blood is spilled. The fire was small, no bigger than a man's hat, but it threw light farther than it should have in that darkness. The night had a way of making small things loom large. The crackle of a burning twig sounded like a pistol cocking, and every shadow felt like it was leaning closer to listen. They sat opposite each other, the flames caught in the hollows of their faces, turning his eyes into dark wells she couldn't read. Somewhere out beyond the glow, a coyote called, long, mournful, and far too close. He hadn't spoken for near an hour, just sat with his hands loose on his knees, staring into the fire like it might give him answers. She wanted to ask, but part of her feared the reply more than the silence. Out here, truth had teeth, and a bit deep. Finally, his voice came, low and rough, like a man dragging something heavy behind him. I knew him, he said. No name, no explanation, just those 3 words, dropped into the night like a stone into deep water. She felt her throat tighten. He didn't need to name the man, there was only one him that mattered. Her enemy. The one who'd lit her world on fire and left her to sift through the ashes. The one she'd been chasing across miles of dust and blood. She waited for more, but he let the silence stretch, forcing her to step into it. How, she asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know. His gaze finally lifted from the fire. Worked for him, he said. Long time ago. Before I knew what he was. The flames popped, sending a spark into the night. She watched it die in the dirt. Her mind caught on his words, worked for him. That made him part of it. Part of the machine that had ground her life down to nothing. Her hand twitched toward her revolver, but she kept it still, resting in her lap. Then he leaned forward, elbows on his knees, the firelight cutting his face into sharp planes. He wasn't just my boss, he said. He was my brother. The words hit harder than any bullet. She blinked, not trusting her own ears. The fire popped again, louder this time, like it was marking the moment. And somewhere deep inside, she wondered if this ride had been leading her not toward justice, but straight into a trap. The town rose out of the dust like a mirage, all sharp angles and hollow windows, the bones of a place that used to breathe. Once, it had been loud with miners' shouts and the clink of gold against tin plates. Now it was a carcass. Wind moved through it like a thief, lifting dust into lazy swirls that drifted between leaning buildings. A sign above the main street swayed on rusted chains, its letters worn to a faint ghost of paint. It creaked with each pass of the wind, like it wanted to speak but had forgotten how. They rode slow, the sound of hooves muffled by the thick layer of dirt and time. Shutters banged softly somewhere ahead, their hinges long past caring. A tumbleweed rolled across the street, snagged against a post, and stayed there, trapped like everything else in this place. She kept her hand near her gun. Places like this had a way of hiding things. Sometimes the living. Sometimes worse. They reached the sheriff's office, the largest building still standing. The door hung crooked, one hinge broken, so it swung inward with a groan that echoed in the emptiness. Inside, dust lay thick enough to remember every step they took. A desk sat in the corner, scarred and splintered, drawers half open as if someone had searched them in a hurry years ago, and never came back. She moved closer, fingers brushing the edge. Something small and cold rested in the open drawer. She lifted it into the light, and her breath caught. A locket, tarnished, but still holding its shape, she knew it without opening it. The curve of the metal, the small dent on the left side. Her mother's. It shouldn't have been here. It shouldn't have been anywhere near this town. Yet here it was, resting in the sheriff's desk like it had been waiting for her. The air shifted. It was nothing more than a change in weight, a subtle tightening, but she felt it like a hand on her spine. Then came the sound, faint, measured, deliberate. Spurs. Not fast, not slow. Just steady, like whoever wore them knew exactly where they were going, and wasn't in a hurry. The rhythm of the steps grew louder, the metallic jingle threading through the dark until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. She didn't move. Not yet. Night wrapped the desert in silver and shadow. The moon hung low, a pale coin in a sky scraped clean of clouds. Their horses' hooves crunched softly over the dry earth, each step loud in the kind of quiet that feels like it's listening. No wind. No insects. Just the creak of saddle leather and the slow, wary rhythm of breathing. She kept her eyes moving, scanning the jagged silhouettes of rocks and scrub. The land here had a way of swallowing men whole, without leaving so much as a whisper. A ridge loomed ahead, its black edge cutting the moonlight. Every instinct told her it was wrong, too still, too perfect. She slowed her horse without thinking, fingers brushing the butt of her revolver. The rancher glanced at her, reading the tension in her shoulders, but said nothing. Somewhere beyond that ridge, something was waiting. She could feel it. Not in the air, in her bones. They entered the narrow pass. The rock walls closed in, high and jagged, the moon reduced to a thin slice overhead. Her eyes searched every shadow, every dark shape clinging to the stone. That's when she noticed it, a glint. Small. Sharp. Gone in an instant. Her breath locked in her chest. She opened her mouth to speak, but the world answered first. The first shot cracked the silence in two. Stone splintered inches from her head, dust raining down from the wall. Another shot followed, then another, quick, deliberate, from different angles. Horses reared, screaming in fear. She swung down from the saddle, rolling behind a boulder as bullets sparked off the rock. The rancher was still in the open, stunned, his hand fumbling for his gun. She didn't think. She moved. Her pistol barked twice, the muzzle flash blinding in the dark. One shadow on the ridge pitched forward, tumbling out of sight. She grabbed the rancher's coat, yanking him into cover just as a bullet tore a groove in the dirt where he'd been standing. His eyes met hers, shock, gratitude, fear, all in one breath. He fired past her shoulder, and the night swallowed the echo. The gunfire slowed. Then, from the dark, came a groan. They found him sprawled behind a rock, clutching his side, blood seeping through his fingers. A boy, no more than 20, his eyes darted between them, wild with pain and something else, guilt. "They know," he rasped. She crouched, pressing the barrel of her gun against his jaw. "Know what?" His breath rattled. "They know you're coming." The sun hadn't yet claimed the sky. It lingered somewhere behind the jagged teeth of the mountains, bleeding a thin smear of gold across the ridge. The land between was all shadow and frost, brittle grass whispering under the weight of two riders. Their horses moved slow, steady, every hoofbeat a muffled drum on the cold earth. The rancher rode ahead, a dark silhouette framed by the first hesitant light. His shoulders were set, his gaze fixed on a point far beyond sight. She hung back by a length, close enough to see the tension in him, far enough to keep her own thoughts hidden. The silence out there wasn't the kind that simply happened. It was the kind that settled after the wind had died, after the birds had fled, after every living thing had decided to keep its head low and wait for whatever was coming. It pressed in on them, thick and heavy, until even the creak of saddle leather sounded too loud. She could feel the weight of it on her chest, that strange sense of being watched though nothing moved. Each step forward felt like walking into the hollow of a great animal's breath, a place that could turn violent without warning. Her eyes traced the rancher's right hand, the one that never drifted far from the worn handle of his revolver. Even at this distance, she could see the way his fingers curled, ready to close at the first hint of danger. She wondered if it was habit, or if he knew something she didn't. The trail ahead wound through low, skeletal trees, their branches clawing at the pale morning like the hands of the dead. Somewhere beyond those trees lay the ranch. His brother's ranch. Her enemy's ranch. The thought was a stone in her gut. They rode for another mile before he spoke. His voice was low, carried more by the stillness than by strength. He told her of the land they were riding toward, how it had been bought in blood, carved from people who'd had nothing but dirt to their name. How his brother's hands were as dirty as the soil they'd claimed. She listened, her jaw tight, but said nothing. She'd known pieces of this story, but hearing it from him was different. It made the air between them feel sharper, colder. Finally, she broke her silence. Her voice was calm, but there was iron beneath it. She told him why she was really here. It wasn't revenge she was chasing, not entirely. It was the land. The stretch of earth her mother had worked with her own hands, stolen in the night when there was no one to stand guard. She wanted it back, no matter how much blood had to be spilled to take it. He didn't answer right away. He just kept riding, jaw clenched, eyes forward. The horizon was beginning to glow now, a thin blade of light cutting the night in two. Somewhere out there, her enemy was waking, maybe drinking coffee, maybe checking the fences, maybe loading his gun. The thought made her pulse slow, steady, like a predator's before the pounce. She glanced at the rancher, wondering which side he'd stand on when the shooting started. That was when his voice cut through the cold morning air, quiet but sharp. "If you had one bullet left, would you take justice or mercy?" The sun had barely cleared the horizon, its first light spilling across the valley like a blade drawn from its sheath. The house stood alone at the center of the land, wide, low, and mean-looking, the way a rattlesnake might squat in the dust, waiting for something foolish to get close. She could hear the slow creak of her saddle leather, the low snort of the rancher's horse beside hers. Neither of them spoke. Words had no place in a ride like this. The porch was empty. The windows, black as dead eyes, stared back at them without blinking. A faint wind carried the smell of smoke, and something sweeter. Too sweet. The kind of sweetness that comes from rot, the kind that hides beneath floorboards. Every instinct in her screamed trap. The stillness. The smell. The way the shadows didn't quite move right. But she didn't stop. Not here. Not now. They stepped inside. The air was heavy, thick enough to drink. It felt like the walls had been holding their breath for years, waiting for someone to break the silence. And then she saw him. Slumped in a high-backed chair. Skin pale and thin as onion paper, but his eyes, sharp, alive, cutting straight through her. He smiled, slow, deliberate, like he'd been expecting her since the day she was born. "You've got your mother's eyes," he rasped, voice dry as dust. Her hand went to the gun without thinking. She'd pictured this moment 100 different ways, in fire, in fury, with a bullet finding its home between his eyes. But now, it felt different. This wasn't the roaring beast she'd hunted across years and miles. This was smaller. Sicker. But the rot inside him? Still there. Still dangerous. Her finger tightened on the grip. Somewhere deep down, she wanted to finish it here, in this room, under this same roof where so much had been stolen from her. But before she could move, she heard footsteps behind her. The rancher stepped forward. His shadow stretched across the warped floorboards, reaching toward the chair. His voice was calm, steady, but carried something she hadn't heard before. A decision already made. His hand hovered near his holster, not quite touching it, not quite ready to let go. She looked at him, searching for a sign of what he was about to do. But his eyes stayed on the man in the chair. When he moved, it was fast. What he chose to do next, it wasn't justice. It wasn't mercy. It was something else entirely, something that made her breath catch, and for the first time since they'd met, she wasn't sure if she could trust him. Sunrise bled over the ridgeline, slow and steady, turning the sky the color of old whiskey. The air carried that sharp, cold bite you only get in the desert before the day burns it away. She rode alone, her horse's hooves whispering against the hard-packed earth, each step pulling her farther from the ranch, from the man she'd left standing in the doorway. She didn't look back. In the west, looking back was just another way to get shot in the spine. Somewhere behind her, the house would already be shrinking into the dust. Somewhere behind her, the truth was still settling like smoke after a gunfight. By the time she reached the edge of town, the streets were still sleeping, no voices, no boots on the boardwalk, just the sigh of wind through the gaps in the shutters. She stopped at the saloon, tied the reins without hurry. Her boots clicked against the porch boards as she stepped to the wall. From inside her coat, she drew a single playing card, edges worn soft, the Queen of Spades staring back at her like she knew too much. With one clean strike of her knife, she nailed it to the wood. A mark. A warning. A memory no one could ignore. They thought they'd seen her last. The voice comes low, steady, the kind of voice that sounds like it knows secrets you shouldn't. But in the West, legends don't die, they just change their names. The wind carried her away, scattering her trail into nothing. Folks who found that card would talk for weeks, maybe months. Some would swear it meant she'd be back. Others would pray she wouldn't. But far beyond the chatter, up on a jagged ridge that cut across the sky, a figure stood watching. Still a stone. Hat brim low. The kind of shadow you don't forget. The sun climbed higher, throwing gold over the land, catching the edge of that figure's face, just enough to hint at eyes that didn't blink, didn't soften. The horse shifted beneath them, restless, as if it knew this was only the start of something worse. From where they stood, they could see her riding away, small against the horizon but not gone. Never gone. The West didn't bury its ghosts, it let them ride until the dust swallowed them whole. And somewhere out there, her name, whatever it was now, would be whispered again. The sun climbed higher, throwing gold over the land, catching the edge of that figure's face, just enough to hint at eyes that didn't blink, didn't soften. The horse shifted beneath them, restless, as if it knew this was only the start of something worse. From where they stood, they could see her riding away, small against the horizon but not gone. Never gone. The west didn't bury its ghosts, it let them ride until the dust swallowed them whole. So if you've got the grit to ride with her, stick close. There's more trail ahead, and you won't want to miss the next turn.